republicanism guide policy changes designed to improve the condition of all people. What are the most pressing domestic and global challenges facing Americans today and in the future? And what policies can you suggest to address them? You may begin.
Thomas Hobbes recognized that the human condition without government regulation would have been chaotic. He proposed a social contract in which citizens gave up their individual rights in exchange for basic protections from the state. Later, Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke proposed that we should not only expect protection of the state, but protection from the state, a notion reflected in our Bill of Rights. At the same time, the agrarian economy that de Tocqueville admired at the time of the framing was built on a commitment to the common good. The next century saw significant changes in the human condition. The end of slavery resulted in the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Urbanization and the rise of the industrial state made it less possible for citizens to be self-reliant, increasing the need for government regulation and prompting the creation of a federal income tax through the 16th Amendment. As the regulatory state has expanded to protect the common good, the instinct to protect individual rights has also grown. Today, there is an acknowledgement that the rights recognized by the US Constitution, such as the right to vote, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion, allow citizens to pursue the basic and psychological needs that Maslow's hierarchy recognized as essential to reaching self-fulfillment and happiness.
While natural rights philosophy was extremely successful in making positive changes in the human condition to get out of the Middle Ages, it carries the risk of a prioritization of one's personal advancement over the common good. Classical republicanism recognizes that a commitment to the common good, supported by an educated and engaged citizenry, is essential. Today, an overemphasis on natural rights has created a belief that an individual doesn't have to care about the repercussions for the greater good when they're considering an action. Because people's rights can be in tension with each other, policy decisions must be made in accordance with both classical Republican and natural rights philosophies. However, for many issues, a classical Republican approach would be much more effective in policymaking, as it would force individuals to promote the common good. Without a higher emphasis on the common good, America will continue to see some of its most important problems worsen.
Today, a classical Republican approach can be used to improve human conditions. Our panel will focus on three pressing challenges: climate change, the devaluation of truth, and wealth inequality. Even as the effects of climate change have worsened globally, many corporations and individuals in America have asserted their rights as a tool to advance their own goals or the goals of their company, even if that action has the effect of worsening the environment. In order to help fight the climate crisis, the US should adopt a carbon tax. By putting a price on carbon can deter large companies that are emitting greenhouse gases, which is one of the biggest causes of climate change. Climate change is among the many issues exacerbated by the devaluation of truth. Through social media and new forms of communication, the way in which we obtain our information is changing drastically. Algorithms point individuals toward more extreme content, and opinions often get more likes and shares than facts, leaving little room for nuance and truth. Policy changes that prioritize the classical Republican value of civic education could help to keep misinformation on social media platforms at bay.
Inequality has plagued the US from the beginning of our nation, and today our right to sustenance and safety is being threatened, as currently 1 in 4 households are experiencing food insecurity. In the 60s and early 70s, it looked like there was going to be a recognition of poverty as a protected class under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, in cases such as Harper v. Virginia State Board of Elections and Bodie v. Connecticut. But the Supreme Court's decision in San Antonio School District v. Rodriguez that school districts could be unequally funded through property taxes dashed that hope. Wealth inequality and food insecurity both disproportionately affect minority populations. Policymakers can help reduce these issues by implementing a higher minimum wage, expanding food assistance programs, and universal access to adequate healthcare and education. We are now open for questions.
All right, thank you. So I appreciate your focus and some specific items regarding domestic. And I just want to ask a question a bit broader regarding global challenges and how, as Americans, we address them. And specifically, what international organizations, if any, do you believe that the United States should belong to in order to assist in addressing global challenges?
Personally, I think NATO is a great organization worldwide that the the US is a part of and it should continue to be a part of, because it can deal with a lot of those global challenges that face many other countries, and domestically it can deal with a lot of problems that face ours on the military standpoint of things.
I think there's also a strong argument for the US to be involved in a lot of economic international organizations, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, so that especially in times of recession, we can help other countries get loans that they need.
All right, Chief Judge Snow.
How can the U.S. ensure that its elections are fair, and what can it do to engender more confidence in its citizenry that the election has been fair?
Voter suppression has been a big issue in our country very recently, so that and addressing voter suppression can help to make sure that elections are more fair. We see with the bill HR 1, it's a voting rights bill to address voting rights in ways such as just lowering campaign finance in politics, since campaign finance does play a high role in politics.
Additionally, on many Native American reservations, there are issues with voting and PO boxes, where voters have to have a physical address to vote. And in many of these reservations, they only have PO boxes. So expanding voting rights to allow for PO boxes as an address would be a really important step in granting voting rights for Native Americans.
In answering the second part of your question, in order to ensure more confidence in our elections, there should be a higher amount of civic education, especially surrounding media literacy, to ensure that people aren't as convinced by fake news that might come up on the internet. And that could be shown in the 2019 Colorado Media Literacy Bill that mandated that media literacy be taught along with civic education.
Thank you.
I'm going to go back to something you were talking about, which was that tension that occurs between looking at a classical Republican versus a natural rights philosophy way of solving problems. So how can we rectify that tension, especially given the polarization that's happening right now, in order to work towards these challenges?
Well, I would argue that these things actually aren't always in tension and that they can coexist at the same time, because often we look at it as natural rights versus classical republicanism, where we can see in some examples like climate change that those things can coexist and help benefit the common good and individual rights.
Historically, de Tocqueville also addressed this balance as a sort of enlightened self-interest. So people have to realize that addressing the common good and helping the common good also helps their natural rights.
Additionally, a true approach to classical republicanism involves having natural rights that you choose to put to the side to secure rights for the greater good. And so a true approach to classical republicanism also grants individual rights.
So again, turning to the global stage, under what circumstances, if any, should the United States declare war on any other country?
I would take more what a foreign policy advisor would call idealist policy, when an individual or a country is violating the United Declaration of Human Rights, which the US can take a huge step in signing that first. But when there are violations of human rights abroad, that the US should declare war and kind of get involved in those military conflicts.
I would disagree.
In addition, there is a more realist perspective for when America should go into war, that some people believe that it's when American interests are at threat, and that's another reason as to why to go to war.
Applying the Tocquevillian enlightened self-interest analogy to the world stage, to what extent can or should the United States facilitate and even subsidize the administration of COVID vaccinations worldwide without creating the perception that it is not serving American interests first?
I think it's very important for America to take that stance within the world and help countries such as India and Brazil that have seen increasing COVID cases to an extent that might be more necessary than within our own country.
One way that we could see this is through the Mayflower Compact, where commonwealths put the individual put their individual rights to the side and furthered the idea of the common good. And we can apply that to a global scale with these COVID vaccines. And administering them worldwide can help us both domestically and on a global scale.
Okay. So kind of taking that idea a little bit and talking about our policy with other countries, do you believe the United States should encourage or discourage trade with countries that are guilty of things like human rights violations?
I would argue that the United States should discourage that because we are a country that furthers human rights, or furthers the idea of human rights and furthers the idea of democracy. And we want democracy to be a worldwide unified thing. And if we were to encourage these places that are violating human rights, that would undermine our democracy and undermine democracy on a world stage.
And a way we can decide whether a country is committing human rights violations is through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we are not signatories for, but I think we should sign because it's really important. It's a really important general recognition of when human rights are being violated in a lot of these countries.
So what do you think that the advantages and disadvantages are of the United States promoting democracy around the world?
Well, like we have been talking about, this idea of human rights and human rights under democracy is a huge thing that would be a pro for promoting democracy, because we like human rights and we like everybody being protected. And if that were to be a global standpoint, that would be in the best interest of the United States.
However, a lot of the time there are issues with war and creating refugee crises. And there are also issues with drone strikes and due process rights towards American citizens. So it's really important to also balance a lot of the effects or the negative effects that war has.
Additionally, if I could finish my statement.
Go ahead.
I would also argue that when America gets involved in these regions and increases conflict, it can lead to more of a resistance by the people within these countries. In the end, could lead to more, less of a protection of these human rights.
Thank you. Good job. Well done. I enjoyed, you had a great pace, and particularly in your testimony. And I thought that you had so many examples. It was very smart on a question that's very difficult to incorporate constitutional principles. You were very smart at least naming off parts of the Constitution, but then going back, talking about, you named 3 cases, which that's not easy to do either in Unit 6. And I liked how you came in very powerful on, this is what we're going to focus on. And you're 1, 2, 3. I would suggest that I felt that you have this wealth of information, but you felt a little hesitant to really dive into the cross-examination responses. And don't be shy about adding to the question and drawing out the discussion a little bit. It's hard when, it's harder when you have a group of 4 as opposed to 3, stepping on each other, particularly on Zoom, but you did a good job. But I felt like there was a little bit of restraint on where you could really jump in and add a little bit more. So that going forward, I would just suggest that. But I enjoyed it very much.
I would agree with you. I thought that testimony was very interesting, very well presented, very thought-provoking. I also thought that when we got into the cross-examination, there was good participation by all of you. And I wouldn't say really that there's a weak one among them. All of you threw out some thoughts that had some really good ideas to them. But I would also agree with Judge Simons that sometimes I just felt like you could have told me more than you did. You encapsulated a lot into a few words. And I appreciated that. I thought it was very erudite. but I want to hear more from I want to hear more.
So I echo my fellow judges' remarks. I do want to say that I really appreciate how clearly you laid out not just your responses to follow-up questions, but also your opening statement. It was very easy to follow, to see the progression. Just to kind of piggyback on that, developing more, I noticed that a lot with my follow-up question where I talked about the tension, and then there was a great answer about they're not always in tension, and it was climate change. And then I was waiting for well, what is it about climate change? Show me how they're not in tension with it. So that idea of make that statement and then try and come up with an example to illustrate it. But I thought you guys did a great job, and I really liked your interpretation of the question, and it was a good round.
Good job.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for judging.
Thank you.
Thank you. And, good luck this afternoon and tomorrow. And, please try and enjoy a little bit of this moment.
Mhm.